When a lone surveyor finds her personal coffee mug waiting for her on a desolate hillside, she knows the threat isn't in the wilderness around her. It's already been inside her home. Welcome to Echoed Chronicles. For this tale, we travel to the sun-scorched foothills of the Sierra Nevada, where a summer job becomes a season of quiet dread. The heat was the first thing Corinne noticed. Not the oppressive, humid heat of the East Coast city she'd left behind, but a dry, predatory heat that seemed to radiate from the very asphalt of the highway. It baked the rolling, golden hills of California into a uniform shade of tinder, the scattered oaks offering pools of sharp, black shadow that did little to promise relief. She had the air conditioning in her 2008 Toyota RAV4 blasting, but it felt like a losing battle, a small pocket of manufactured chill in a world that wanted to cook her. For the last hour, she'd been on State Route 49, a winding two-lane road that hugged the contours of the Sierra Nevada foothills. The job was a summer contract with a geological consulting firm out of Sacramento. 3 months of surveying a remote stretch of land for mineral deposits, a task that required precision, patience, and a tolerance for solitude. Corinne had all three. As a geological surveyor, solitude was part of the appeal. It was out here, in the quiet emptiness of the land, that the earth told its stories, and her job was to listen. The town, when she finally rolled into it, was called Coulter Creek. It wasn't much more than a wide spot in the road, a collection of historic-looking buildings with false fronts leaning against one another, their paint peeling under the relentless sun. A single gas station, a general store with a dusty porch, and a bar called the Panning Hand seemed to make up the entire commercial district. Her rental was on the outskirts, a small single-story house that the listing had generously called a rustic bungalow. Her landlord, a man named Silas, was waiting on the porch. He was a tall, stooped man in his late 60s, with a face as weathered as the redwood siding of the house. He wiped a sweaty hand on his jeans before offering it to her. His grip was surprisingly strong. "You must be Corinne," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Figured that was you. Not too many new cars come up this way." "That's me," she said, trying for a friendly smile. "It's a bit warmer than I expected." "This is just the morning," Silas said with a dry chuckle. "Wait till the afternoon gets a hold of you. Come on, I'll show you the place." He led her inside. The air was stale and thick with the scent of old wood and dust. The furniture was a sparse collection of mismatched pieces that looked like they'd been gathered over decades. Silas pointed out the basics: the finicky thermostat, the circuit breaker in the hall closet, the water heater that, he warned, likes to take its time in the morning. He lingered longer than a typical landlord might. When he showed her the bedroom, he made a point of demonstrating the lock on the window. "It's an old one, but it's solid. You push the lever down, see? No one's getting in through there. You'll be safe and sound." The comment hung in the air, a strange and unnecessary assurance. Coulter Creek didn't seem like the kind of place one had to worry about home invasions. Corinne just nodded. "Good to know. Thank you." "Yeah," Silas continued, his eyes scanning the room before settling back on her. "A young woman like you all the way out here by yourself. Gotta be careful. People know you're here alone." He wasn't wrong, but the way he said it felt less like a piece of friendly advice and more like an observation he'd been dwelling on. He finally left after a tour that felt exhaustingly thorough, leaving Corinne standing in the middle of the small living room, the silence of the house pressing in on her. She shook off the feeling. He was just an old countryman, probably a bit lonely, making conversation. She had work to do. The next 2 weeks settled into a comfortable rhythm. Corinne would wake before dawn, the air outside still cool and smelling of pine and dust. She'd make coffee, pack a lunch and at least a gallon of water, and load her surveying equipment into the RAV4. The tripod, the bulky case for the theodolite, the GPS rover, and a satchel with her rock hammer, sample bags, and field notebook. Her survey area was about 5 miles from the house, up a barely there dirt road that rattled the Toyota's suspension. It was a beautiful, lonely place. The land was a complex tapestry of metamorphic rock, granite outcroppings, and dry creek beds thick with manzanita. Her days were long and physically demanding, spent hiking from point to point, setting up the tripod, taking precise measurements, and chipping away at rock faces to collect samples. She saw more deer and coyotes than people. The work was absorbing, the data clean. At the end of the day, she would drive back to the bungalow, shower off the grime, eat a simple dinner, and fall into a heavy, dreamless sleep. The first disruption was small. So small, she almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. It was the start of her 3rd week. She was working a transect line across a shallow ravine, a particularly tricky bit of terrain. The day before, she had placed a survey marker, a wooden stake with a bright orange flag and a small aluminum tag stamped with its coordinates, at a key reference point on the opposite ridge. It was her final task of the day, and she remembered driving it deep into the hard, dry soil. But when she set up her equipment that morning and sighted the location, the stake wasn't there. She scanned the area through the theodolite's powerful lens, a knot of annoyance tightening in her stomach. Had an animal knocked it over? A deer, maybe, or a wild pig? She packed up her gear and spent 20 minutes scrambling across the ravine. She found the marker lying on its side, about 10 feet from where she had planted it. The ground around the original hole was undisturbed. No tracks, no signs of digging. It looked as if someone had simply plucked it out of the earth and tossed it aside. She frowned, picking it up. It was probably just kids, teenagers from town, maybe driving up here to drink and causing some pointless mischief. It was irritating. The markers were the backbone of her entire survey. Their placement had to be exact. She found the original hole, drove the stake back in, and used her GPS unit to verify the location down to the centimeter. Cost her nearly an hour of work. She tried to put it out of her mind, but a new, quiet awareness followed her for the rest of the day. The silence of the hills seemed different now, less peaceful and more watchful. The snap of a twig in the underbrush made her jump. The distant cry of a hawk sounded like a warning. 2 days later, it happened again. This time, it was a marker she had set only hours before. She had placed it, hiked 200 yards to a new vantage point to take a backsight reading, and when she looked through the lens, the bright orange flag was gone. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was different. This wasn't overnight mischief. This was immediate. Someone had watched her place the marker and then, in the few minutes it took her to walk away, they had removed it. She slowly lowered the theodolite and stood up, her skin prickling despite the heat. She was alone. She had to be. She hadn't seen another car, hadn't heard an engine or a voice. She scanned the surrounding hills, her eyes tracing the lines of the scrub oak and pines, searching for a glint of light, a patch of color that wasn't supposed to be there, anything. There was nothing, just the shimmering air and the low buzz of insects. A cold dread, entirely separate from the external heat, began to seep into her. This wasn't random. Vandalism was one thing. This felt personal. It was a direct, calculated interference with her work. Someone was out here watching her. They were close enough to see what she was doing, silent enough to move without being detected, and bold enough to do it in broad daylight. She packed her equipment with trembling hands, her methodical process abandoned in a rush of pure fear. She didn't bother looking for the second stake. She just wanted to get back to her car, back to the flimsy security of her rental house. As she drove down the bumpy dirt road, her eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a figure emerge from the trees and stand watching her leave. But there was only a rising cloud of dust, hanging in the still, hot air. That night, sleep offered no escape. Every creak of the old house settling was the sound of a footstep on the porch. The whisper of the wind through the eaves was a voice just outside her window. She got up 3 times to check the locks on the doors and the solid, old-fashioned latch on the bedroom window that Silas had pointed out. Each time they were secure, but security felt like an illusion. A lock only worked if someone tried to force it. It did nothing to stop a person who was content to simply stand on the other side, watching. In the morning, the bright, unforgiving sunlight did little to dispel the fear. It only illuminated the dust motes dancing in the stale air of the bungalow. The thought of going back up that dirt road, back to the silent, watchful hills, was nauseating. She couldn't do it. Not today. She called her project manager in Sacramento, a man named Dave. She tried to keep her voice steady, professional. "Dave, hi, it's Corinne. I'm having a bit of an issue on site. Everything okay? Equipment trouble?" "Of a sort," she said, choosing her words carefully. "It seems we have a persistent vandal. Someone's been pulling up my survey markers. It's happened twice now." There was a pause on the line. "Pulling them up? You mean like kids messing around?" "The first time, maybe, but yesterday, it happened minutes after I placed a marker. I was only a couple 100 yards away. It's deliberate, targeted interference." She left out the part about the terror, about the feeling of being watched. She didn't want to sound like a hysterical woman calling from the woods. She was a professional. "Damn," Dave said, a sigh of pure administrative frustration. "Some local, you think? Someone with a grudge against the company or thinks we're going to tear the place up?" "I have no idea. I haven't seen anyone. That's what's so unnerving." "Right? Okay. Well, look, document everything. Take photos if it happens again. The time, the location. We need a paper trail if we have to get the sheriff involved. But try to avoid it if you can. We don't want to start a feud with the locals on day one. Maybe be a little more discreet." Corinne almost laughed. How was she supposed to be more discreet hauling a tripod and a theodolite across an open hillside? "I'll do my best," she said, the words tasting like ash. "I'm going to work on data processing and mapping from the house today. I need to recalibrate my approach." "Good call. You do that. Let me know if it continues." She hung up, feeling more alone than ever. Dave's response was exactly what she'd expected. Practical, corporate, and 1,000 miles away. The problem was hers to solve. She spent the morning at the small kitchen table, her laptop open, but she couldn't focus on the columns of data. Her eyes kept drifting to the windows. The house was surrounded by a perimeter of dry, dusty ground, a patch of earth the sun had baked into a pale, cracked surface. Her own footprints from the day before were clearly visible, leading from her car to the porch steps. Around noon, she stood up to stretch, her back aching from the tension. She walked into her bedroom and glanced out the window, the one with the solid lock, and then she saw it. Just below the window, in the fine, pale dust, was a single perfect footprint. It was deep and clear, the tread pattern of a heavy work boot etched into the ground. It wasn't hers. Her hiking boots had a completely different sole. This print was larger, wider, and it was fresh. It hadn't been there when she'd left for work yesterday morning. She knew this with absolute certainty because she had noticed a lizard sunning itself on that exact patch of bare earth. Someone had stood right there. They had stood inches from her bedroom window, shielded from the road by the corner of the house, and looked in. Last night, this morning, while she was on the phone with Dave, Her breath caught in her throat. The cold dread from the hills had followed her home. It was here. It had been right outside her window while she slept. The thought was so violating it made her physically sick. She backed away from the window, a strangled sob escaping her lips. The vandal wasn't just a prankster. This was something else entirely. This was a violation. She needed to get out. The walls of the small house were suddenly suffocating. She grabbed her keys and her wallet and practically ran to her car, not bothering to lock the door behind her. What was the point? She drove into Coulter Creek, the 10-minute drive feeling like an hour. She parked in front of the general store, the only place that seemed to have any signs of life. The bell above the door chimed as she entered, the air inside smelling of sawdust and coffee. An older woman with a kind, wrinkled face and a cloud of white hair stood behind the counter. "Help you with something, dear?" the woman asked. Corinne's mind raced. What could she even ask? "Do you know who owns the old survey plot up past Ridge Road? Have you seen a man in big boots creeping around my rental?" She sounded insane. I need a bottle of water," she managed, her voice thin. As the woman got the water, a man came in. He was younger than Silas, maybe in his early 40s, with a sun-beaten face and intense, pale blue eyes. He wore a faded flannel shirt despite the heat and a dusty baseball cap. He gave Corinne a brief, assessing glance before turning to the woman at the counter. "Afternoon, Mary," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried a strange intensity. "Afternoon, Owen." "The woman," Mary replied. "The usual?" He nodded, his gaze drifting back to Corinne. It wasn't a friendly or curious look. It was a stare, cold, analytical, and unsettlingly long. Corinne's skin crawled. She paid for her water, her hands fumbling with the cash. "You're the surveyor," Owen said. It wasn't a question. Corinne froze, her hand on the door. "Yes," she said, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "How did you know?" A small, thin smile touched his lips but didn't reach his eyes. "Small town. People talk." Silas mentioned he rented his place out to a geologist from back east. He took a step closer. "Find what you're looking for up there?" The question was laced with something she couldn't decipher. Felt like a test. "It's a preliminary survey," she said, keeping her tone flat. "Just mapping the area." "Right? Mapping," he repeated, drawing the word out. He looked past her, out the dusty window toward the hills. "Some things up there don't like to be mapped." The bell chimed again as she pushed the door open, escaping into the searing heat. She didn't look back as she hurried to her car. She could feel his eyes on her back the entire time. The encounter had lasted less than a minute, but it had left her trembling, a new, specific face now attached to her nameless dread. "Owen, some things up there don't like to be mapped." It wasn't a warning. It was a threat. Back in the bungalow, the oppressive silence was gone, replaced by the memory of Owen's voice. His words echoed in the small rooms. Asterisk small town. People talk. Asterisk of course they did. Silas had told Owen or told someone who told Owen. Her presence wasn't just known. It was a topic of conversation. She was the outsider, the variable, the woman from back east. Some things up there don't like to be mapped. It was a claim of ownership, a declaration that her charts and numbers were an invasion of a private domain. The footprint outside her window was no longer just a sign of a voyeur. It was a message from him. Asterisk, I can get this close. I can watch you sleep. This is my land, and you are on it. Asterisk. Corinne felt a surge of defiant anger cut through the fear. This was her job. She had a contract, a duty to her employer. She wouldn't be chased off by some backwoods intimidator. Dave's voice replayed in her head. Asterisk, document everything. take photos. Asterisk, he was right. Quitting now without concrete proof would look like she couldn't handle the job. She needed undeniable evidence that the site was being actively and maliciously compromised. The next morning, she made a decision. She would go back one more time, not to survey but to document. She would photograph the original hole of the second missing stake, catalog the footprints, and record everything in her field notes with a clinical detachment. She would build a case file, a professional report of interference that would force Dave to take her seriously. It was a risk, but it felt like the only way to reclaim a shred of control. She drove up the dirt road with a grim resolve, the RAV4 crawling over the ruts. The air was still and heavy. When she arrived at the survey area, she left her expensive equipment in the car, taking only her phone and a satchel with her notebook. She hiked to the spot where the second marker had vanished. The small hole she had dug was still there, a perfect circle in the hard-packed earth. She knelt, angling her phone to get a clear picture of it, documenting the lack of disturbance around the perimeter. As she did, a glint of white caught her eye. It was about 15 feet away, nestled at the base of a gnarled manzanita bush. It was a ceramic coffee mug. Her coffee mug, the one she'd been using every single morning in the bungalow. It was a cheap, plain white mug that had been in the kitchen cabinet, one she had washed and left in the dish drainer only yesterday. Corinne's blood ran cold. The anger, the defiance, it all evaporated, leaving behind a pure, crystalline terror. This was impossible. There was no way for it to be here unless someone had entered the house. They had walked into her kitchen, picked it up and brought it here, to her workspace. They had left it for her to find. It was an act of such intimate and contemptuous violation that she felt she might collapse. The barrier between her work and her home, between the watcher in the hills and the watcher at her window, was gone. It was one and the same person, and he had been inside her house. She scrambled backward, away from the mug, her heart pounding a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. She didn't take a picture. Evidence no longer mattered. Nothing mattered except getting away. She turned and ran, stumbling down the rocky slope toward her car, not daring to look back, convinced that Owen was standing somewhere in the trees, watching her, that thin, cold smile on his face. She threw the satchel into the passenger seat and fumbled the key into the ignition, her hands shaking so violently it took 3 tries. The engine roared to life, and she slammed the car into reverse, spinning the wheel and spraying dust and gravel as she tore back down the road. The bungalow was no longer a refuge. It was a compromised space, a trap. As soon as she pulled up, she ran inside, her eyes scanning the living room, the kitchen. Nothing seemed out of place, which was somehow worse. The intrusion had been clean, precise. A ghost's passage, leaving only a single coffee mug miles away as proof it had ever happened. She threw a duffel bag on her bed and began to frantically pack, grabbing clothes from the dresser with no regard for what they were. T-shirts, socks, jeans. She just needed to go. She moved into the living room, yanking her laptop charger from the wall. The cord snagged on the leg of a small, rickety side table next to the armchair. The table wobbled, and a cheap, dusty picture frame that had been sitting on it tipped over, falling face down onto the wooden floor with a clatter. "Damn it!" she muttered, her nerves screaming. She bent to pick it up, turning it over. It was a faded photograph of 2 men standing in front of an old pickup truck, squinting in the sun. One was a much younger Silas, his stoop not yet pronounced, a proud arm slung over the shoulders of a surly-looking teenager. The teenager had the same pale, intense eyes and the same set, stubborn jaw. It was Owen. So they were related. Of course they were. Silas wasn't a lonely, rambling old man. He was a sentry. His warnings, Asterisk a young woman like you, all the way out here by yourself. People know you're here alone. Asterisk weren't friendly advice. They were facts. They were part of the system of control. He had rented her the house, and his son or nephew or whoever he was had made sure she knew she wasn't welcome on their land. She dropped the frame on the chair and backed away. She had to leave. Not just her clothes, but the survey equipment. It was the company's property, worth thousands of dollars. She couldn't just leave it. Forcing herself into a cold, mechanical calm, she began loading the heavy cases into the back of the RAV4, the theodolite, the tripod, the GPS rover. Each trip from the house to the car was an agony of suspense. She kept expecting to see Owen's truck pull up, to see him walking toward her from the edge of the trees. Finally, it was all loaded. She took one last look around the bungalow, at the life she had tried to build here for 3 months. Felt tainted, soiled. She left the key on the kitchen counter next to the dish drainer where her mug used to be. The drive away from the house was the longest of her life. She kept her eyes locked on the road ahead, but her peripheral vision was on fire. Every shadow seemed to hold a figure. Every glint of sun on a distant windshield was a threat. She reached the main road in Coulter Creek. As she passed the general store, she saw Owen's dusty pickup truck parked out front. Through the window, she could see him standing at the counter, talking to Mary. He glanced up as her Toyota passed, and for a second, their eyes met through the glass. There was no expression on his face. Not triumph, not anger, just a flat, cold acknowledgement. He had won. She pressed down on the accelerator, driving past the panning hand, past the town limit sign. She passed the turnoff for Silas's own property. She didn't look. She just drove, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. 5 miles later, 10 miles later, the tight knot in her chest began to loosen. When the sign for State Route 99 appeared, signaling the turnoff towards Sacramento and the wider world, a shudder of relief went through her. She merged onto the freeway, surrounded by anonymous cars and trucks, the protective cover of civilization. She was just another driver, another car in a stream of traffic. She was invisible again. An hour later, she pulled into a brightly lit, bustling gas station. Under the fluorescent lights, surrounded by families and travelers, she finally felt safe enough to stop shaking. She took out her phone. She called Dave. "Corinne, everything okay?" "I'm out," she said, her voice flat and exhausted. "I've left the site. I'm not going back." What happened? Did the vandal come back?" "Yes," she said. "He came into the house I was renting. I'm packing up the equipment and shipping it to the office tomorrow. My field notes and the data I've collected are on my laptop. I'll email them tonight. Consider this my resignation from the project." There was a stunned silence on the other end. "He came in the house? Corinne, did you call the sheriff?" "To what end, Dave?" she asked, the exhaustion giving way to a weary bitterness. "To tell them a local man I can't prove did anything is making me nervous? The landlord is in on it. The whole town knows. There's nothing for me there." She didn't wait for his reply. She ended the call and dropped the phone onto the passenger seat. She bought a coffee and a map of the United States. She sat in her car for a long time, just watching the highway, the endless flow of headlights heading north and south. She didn't know where she was going to go. It didn't feel like she was driving toward anything. It only felt, with a certainty that would linger for years, that she was driving away. The summer was over.